So now we're going to talk about La Clemenza di Tito, which is the second to last opera by Mozart. And I'll talk a little bit about the last months of his life when he was composing this piece. And this is Pacific Opera's first go at this work. We've produced many other Mozart operas, including Idomeneo, which is another one that sort of gets shunted away a little bit more often than it should. So what I should like to start talking about first is what exactly is La Clemenza di Tito. And in order to do that, I need to just remind all of us about the three basic genres of opera, of music drama, that Mozart cultivated and that were cultivated during his day. Do you all know that Mozart moved to Vienna in 1781 and lived there for the remaining 10 years of his life? Because that's when he really flourished as a composer. He had several genuine masterpieces under his belt before he moved there, but he moved to a city that had a thriving professional Italian opera community and audience. And so it was a mecca, a sort of magnet for composers who wanted to succeed in a certain style and at certain genres. And there were basically three operatic genres that were cultivated. First of all, opera seria, which by the time Mozart moved to Vienna was already a little bit passé. It was considered old-fashioned. And its template, the model that was used to construct an opera seria, was considered a bit rigid and static. The very name means a serious work, and generally the subject matter embraced ancient Roman emperors and the aristocracy. And it really was considered ideal entertainment for the aristocracy, for reasons that I'll make clear in a minute. Then there was opera buffa, which means comic opera, but really goes way further than that. It allowed the composers and their collaborators to present subject matter that was perhaps a little bit more topical, more contemporary, and had much more flexibility in the way that the actual story was told. And you've all seen the three great opera buffa of Mozart: Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. And then there is the sort of newly emerging Singspiel, which is the opera in the German language. And virtually at the same time that La Clemenza di Tito was opening, so was Mozart's final masterpiece in that genre, which is the Magic Flute. All you guys on the bus knew the answer to that one. Those are the three things that Mozart excelled at in the operatic field, or in the musico-dramatic field. And opera seria was the one that sort of got neglected after the 18th century turned into the 19th century. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, if we discuss opera seria in the 18th century at all, we must mention two people. And the first one is Handel, George Frederick Handel, who cultivated something like opera seria in London. But Handel was writing for a ticket-buying audience, a very, very broad education and taste, and he had to make sure that he appealed to that audience. And in order to do that, he wrote for star singers, and he made sure that he cajoled them into coming to sing at his opera house by writing arias that they wanted to sing, and by making sure that they were paid enough. Then, as now, the singers made more than the composers. But Handel is kind of one of a kind, so we'll just park him over in London. It was his choice to move there, and he is now known to us as the German composer who wrote Italian operas with French overtures for English audiences, and that's Handel. So we move now to the character of Pietro Metastasio, and it was he who constructed many of the most celebrated operatic texts, or libretti, for opera seria. He was the king of opera seria. And just to give you an idea of how old it was, he was born in the late 17th century, 1698. And he lived in Vienna for the bulk of his adult life, dying there the year after Mozart moved. And so Mozart was familiar with the work of Metastasio. His father would have given him poetry to set. So he was practiced in the art of writing opera seria. But by the time he moved to Vienna, Metastasio was revered, but also sort of looked on as a kind of old news. So he was, certainly his greatness was understood, but he was no longer current. So we'll just put that there too. And we'll mention a little bit now about the time that Mozart was, or the time in Mozart's life when this opera was created. Mozart is often referred to by historians. I will just come right out and say this. In looking at information about this work, I finally realized something, well, I've suspected this for a long time. There is more mythology created around the figure of Mozart than virtually any other composer that I could name. And many of the things that we were sort of brought up believing about Mozart are at best anecdotal and almost certainly false. So when we learned about music appreciation when I was in elementary school, we were told that Mozart died obscure and penniless. He was thrown into a pauper's grave. Everything was undignified. His wife was a terrible money-grubbing sort of harlot. None of that is true. Mozart certainly underwent some financial difficulties in the latter part of his life, but let's look at it this way. Mozart died when he was 35. He had 2 young children and a wife, and he did tend to live somewhat more extravagantly than his income always permitted. But the historians have been able to tally his income for the years that he lived in Vienna, and he was actually a very high earner. He just lived a little bit beyond his means. But let's ask ourselves this question. How many couples in their mid-30s with 2 kids are there today that have absolutely no credit card debt? You know, they didn't have visas in the 1780s, so that explains that. So he was actually an earner, but he had undergone ups and downs. When Mozart moved to Vienna, he moved there as a freelancer, and he never quite was able to get a really solid, stable position that his older contemporary Haydn enjoyed. Now that said, any freelancer will have ups and downs in his or her earning power. Also, the thriving community of Italian opera professionals I mentioned earlier had their cabals and their intrigues and their cliques and the claques. And so Mozart was not always welcomed into it. It must also be said, Mozart was brought up understanding that he was the most gifted and brilliant musician of his time from the age of 6. It's pretty difficult to imagine anybody arriving at adulthood having been brought up like that and not being a tiny little bit arrogant. And of course, let's face it, it's always irritating when conceited people actually are as good as they think they are, and that was Mozart for you. So he didn't always have a warm relationship with everybody in his professional circle. All of this added to the fact that by the time we get to the year of Clemenza, the year of flute, Austria is embroiled in a war with Turkey, and so that means that the revenues are being diverted, and also that the aristocrats who would usually be subscribing to Mozart's concerts and operas are moving out of town to sort of protect themselves from the ravages of war. And war always brings economic depression. So all of these things put together mean that Mozart's undergoing a little bit of difficulty. But if anything, during the summer of 1791, he would die in December of that year, he was overwhelmed with commissions. He had already decided to create this work, the Magic Flute, that we all know and love, but we should remember it was written for what we might call the sort of Broadway of Vienna at the time. So it was not considered absolutely of the first rank in terms of its genre. And then he has, and this is very famous, how many of you have seen Amadeus? A lovely work of fiction perpetrated by Peter Shaffer. And it's worthwhile remembering that Mozart did receive a commission from a rather mysterious emissary of an aristocrat named Count Walsegg. And this commission was to write a requiem in memory of Walsegg's late wife, but to do it rather secretly because Walsegg liked to present this music and claim it as his own. It's strange. So Mozart had this rather lucrative commission, and that was probably enough. However, he then received an invitation to compose an opera seria for the coronation of Leopold in Prague. And the fee was too good for him to turn it down, so he was kind of overworked. And La Clemenza di Tito was written in a relatively short time after he'd more or less completed all the necessary work on flute. So there are a couple of little rumors that I'm going to share with you about Clemenza di Tito. The first is that it was claimed by some historians in the 19th century that it was actually begun as early as 1789, but modern history has debunked that theory. So if you hear anyone say that, just say, no, that's wrong. But the other is that he was working at such a feverish and furious pace that he completed writing this score in the carriage on the way to Prague for its first performance. Now, how many of you have ever tried to write a letter on a bus? Multiply that by about 20, and you get the difficulty of actually composing a score in a carriage with no shock absorption. So maybe, maybe not. We know that Mozart was capable of creating an entire score in his head, and then the mechanics of writing it down could be accomplished while he was having a glass of wine and playing billiards. This is almost inconceivable to me. Imagine creating Hamlet in your mind and then just writing it down. It's inconceivable, but Mozart was able to do that. Another thing I will say about this, because we're going to begin talking about what an opera seria is made up of and what this one is that some of the score was probably written by his assistant or student, depending on the source that you consult, Franz Xaver Süssmayr. So more about him in a while as well. So we have this extraordinary work that was premiered in Prague, and I'd like, before we say anything more about it, to talk about what it's made up of. Now, one thing I will say is that Mozart's overtures are spectacular and wonderful, and this is no exception. So from the first notes of the overture, which, by the way, are meant to be listened to, so please make sure you're seated before it begins, it's a fantastic Mozartian work. Then we're introduced to the world of recitativo. Now, I usually do talk about recitativo when I talk about Mozart, but would you like me to refresh your memory as what it is? This is the medium through which the story is actually told. It's like sung dialogue. How many of you have been to Italy? Okay, they sing anyway, right? When you hear them talking, they're almost singing. And so it's just a little bit of heightened speech. The notes are given pitches, but the note values are meant to be altered so that the rhythm resembles the rhythm of actual speech. So it's not dance-like or metrical. And there are two varieties of recitativo. The first one is secco recitativo. That means dry. And it is recitative that's accompanied only by generally the harpsichord. I was going to say basso continuo, but we don't need to use that term. Sometimes bolstered by the bass or cello. Now, I want to point at that instrument. You've all been to Mozart and Handel operas at Pacific Opera before, correct? So we always use a harpsichord, but this is going to be an exception. The instrument over there is a replica of a piano made in 1782. And this one actually was 200 years later, 1982, it was constructed. Now, of course, you all know Stradivarius violins are still played by professional violinists who can afford them. The piano is a piece of machinery, it must be said, and it does not appreciate with age. So actual, genuine, authentic keyboard instruments from the 18th century will be found only in museums. But this one is made of the same materials and according to the same principles. Would you like me to show you what it sounds like? So, can you hear me now? Okay. It is constructed similarly to a piano, and in that a hammer will strike the string as opposed to the harpsichord's plectra or quill, which plucks the string. The reason the piano was invented really is so that we could create louds and softs with our fingers. In other words, the keys will respond to velocity of touch. Like that, which a harpsichord cannot do. So it's called pianoforte today, which means soft loud. Today we embrace the term forte piano, which means loud soft, so that we can make an easy and efficient distinction between an 18th century piano and a modern one. There's no reason, there's no real historical basis for that. So the sound is different because the materials are different. A big, loud, booming modern piano has a cast iron frame and steel strings that are stretched very tightly to create that brilliant sound. These are generally brass strings, which are much more malleable and soft, and there's only a wood frame. So Mozart could actually carry his instrument around the house. He could carry it up the stairs, well, with some help from his friends. And the hardwood hammers that we use on a modern piano are actually covered in leather on an 18th century piano. So we can create an accompaniment and a melody on the same instrument. On a harpsichord, that would sound, they would be the same dynamic level, they'd be the same volume. Now, you're probably, if you saw this, wondering why there are no pedals. There are, but they're operated by the knees. There's also this little thing I'm going to show you, which is a kind of damper. You've all heard that piece before, I'm sure. So this is the instrument that Kimberly Ann Bartzak will be playing in the pit to accompany the recitativo secco. Later we're going to hear from our conductor, Mr. Giuseppe Pietraroia, but I want to ask you right now, are you doing the secco recitatives with cello or just with keyboard? Just with keyboard. That's the way I like them too, because the singers can move around the dialogue very quickly that way. They're only being followed by one person, and we'll talk about what Kim has to do when Joey comes up to address us. So that is the recitativo secco. It moves quickly, it tells the story. But there are some times in a plot where the events are rather heightened, and we move to another device called recitativo accompagnato, and that's when the orchestra punctuates rather than really when if a character has something important to say, like, my mother-in-law offended me yesterday morning, da-da-da-da-da-da, so I'm going to kill her today. We have all this dramatic stuff coming from the orchestra to sort of comment on what the characters are saying. I shouldn't have used that as an example because this opera is about redemption and forgiveness. But anyway, not all operas are. So that is what we'll hear in addition to arias. Now, I want to talk a little bit about arias because Mozart, Handel, any number of people, Verdi, they liked to know who they were writing the arias for. They needed to know who the singer would be. In Mozart's own words, he said the aria must fit the singer like a perfectly tailored gown or suit. And they knew what singers to hire or to engage for the operas because they had to impress the audience. And so we have a system of star singers. And Mozart will create arias for singers of absolutely dazzling virtuoso technique, like we have in our cast. That means the capability of singing long, expressive cantabile lines or really rapid, agile coloratura passage work. And they can do all of that. So the arias in La Clemenza di Tito are a real showpiece. And that's generally what opera seria will consist of. It'll be recitativo, aria, recitativo, aria. And Mozart hated that. He said he couldn't stand the idea of having singers enter, do their recitative, and then sing an aria, and then leave again. First of all, structurally, it gets very tedious very quickly. But also because in those days, and I'm just making sure that you all understand this, the audience basically talked throughout most of the, so they didn't shut up until the singer began the aria. You aren't going to do that, are you? You're going to be looking at the surtitles to make sure you know what the plot is. And also it takes a great deal of skill to sing recitativo correctly and well. So you'll pay attention to the singers. I know you will. So Mozart and his librettist actually create ensembles. And this is what sets Mozart apart from virtually everybody else of his time, is he tells the story also through ensembles. You'll remember that heavenly trio from Così fan tutte, the wonderful trio from Don Giovanni. Well, this opera is also full of ensembles, which are, I don't know how to put it, sui generis. No other composer really comes close to Mozart when it comes to the creation of these, and this opera deserves all the attention that's finally receiving on that score alone. So let's look now at this commission and what happens. The text that was presented to Mozart was by Metastasio, and it was something like 40 years old and had been set about 40 times by composers as diverse as Gluck, remember him from Orfeo and Euridice, and Salieri, speaking of that movie. You all know that Antonio Salieri was a very successful composer of Italian opera in Vienna at the time. He and Mozart would have had a sometimes strained, sometimes cordial relationship. Certainly Salieri respected Mozart, and the respect was, for the most part, at least professionally returned. One thing Salieri certainly did not do was kill Mozart, just as long as we have that straight. So it was offered to him, and he turned it down because there was insufficient time, he felt, to prepare the opera. So it was really presented as a commission on incredibly short notice. And when Mozart received the text, he looked at it and said, we have to refurbish the entire text. So there was another sort of court poet laureate, we would call it, who was available. And between himself and Mozart, they basically rewrote Metastasio's text and turned it, and Mozart doesn't always refer to these things in his catalog, but he actually wrote, we were able to turn it into a real opera. So he knew exactly what he needed in terms of the text. In that regard, he was a master of dramaturgy, just like Verdi is, just like Puccini is. So he set to work on this composition. As I said, an opera seria will be about an ancient sort of emperor or king. And in the tradition that Mozart inherited from the French composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, does that name ring a bell? Lully, it was actually Italian, and then he became, like so many people do, more French than the French. And he wrote operas for King Louis XIV. And they would present these ancient emperors or gods, some of them were based on Greek mythology, and they represented the ruler. So Louis would walk in, and he was absolutely perfectly fine with being idolized and deified. And the opera would present a story, usually quite complex. And the leader would be presented as the most heroic and brave leader, but also the most ingenious diplomat, and also the most magnanimous of all rulers who had ever lived. And Louis just lapped that up opera after opera after opera. And that's generally what an opera seria was meant to do. And so this one shows us a Tito or a Titus who, according to Alex Chen, who wrote an article for our keynotes, you can get one downstairs, was rather less magnanimous in real life than in this opera, but that's fine. How many people go to operas expecting news? I hope nobody. So most stories will have liberties taken with them, and this is no exception. But we will see dramatic tensions, amorous rivalries, and I love the character Vitellia who wants to kill Titus, and then she changes her mind, and then she changes it back, and then she changes it again. But ultimately, she's forgiven at the end. It's a very interesting story, but please read the plot synopsis because it's a tiny little bit complicated. So this is what Mozart is presenting for the coronation. Now, let's talk briefly about how the work was received when it was first presented, because it has fallen, it has lapsed a little bit in the 20th century. And many historians who I think should know better have sort of swept it under the carpet a little bit, into the dustbin, for reasons that are inexplicable once you listen to the music. And even the harshest critics of La Clemenza di Tito and Idomeneo have conceded that the music is wonderful. But I think that the dramaturgy is also pretty sound. It tells its story remarkably well. So when it was first presented, don't forget it was part of a coronation. There were tons and tons of other things going on, and it basically wasn't noticed. It sort of went as one of the events of the coronation, except by the wife of the new emperor. Joey will tell you exactly what she said. I'll tell you only the English translation, which is essentially German swinishness, she called it. It is in Italian, but I think she had a predisposition against Germans, and Austrians were lumped in together with Germans. So I want to just mention, however, that quote cannot be authenticated because it was brought into the discussion in something like 1871 or 1891, a good 100 years, 80 to 100 years after the premiere. So anybody can make anything up at that point. But in actual fact, it was received much, much more enthusiastically a couple of performances later, so that Mozart could write home that the most amazing thing has happened. We had a performance of flute tonight that received the most rapturous and enthusiastic applause, but I've also heard that the closing performance of Tito in Prague also received rapturous and enthusiastic applause. So it was actually really well received. And it was revived several times during the years immediately following Mozart's death in December of 1791. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it has been restored now, I think, to the public. It's not going to get the same number of performances as Magic Flute, because Magic Flute has been in the top 10 virtually for the last 100 years. But Clemenza's made it into the top 50, and let's hope it ascends a little bit. So you're going to be able to look forward to some incredible singing, but also in wonderful orchestral playing. And I want to mention this because historically, the last year of Mozart's life coincided with his meeting two outstanding musicians. The one that is immortalized by Mozart is Anton Stadler, who played clarinet, and basset horn, which was one of Mozart's favorite instruments. So you all know the Mozart Clarinet Concerto? It was his last completed masterpiece. He wrote 2 arias in La Clemenza di Tito, which feature what's called an obbligato clarinet part. That means that the music written for that instrument is not doubled anywhere else in the orchestra. So you get to hear a duet between a singer and an orchestral clarinetist in the pit. And Anton Stadler actually traveled to Prague with Mozart to play in the first production. We will never know if Mozart conducted that first performance or not. Some people think he did, some people, there's no documented evidence to prove one way or the other. We know he did conduct the first couple of performances of flute, however, and his name was on the poster, which is another argument against his dying an obscure composer. He was obviously considered a draw. Now, I'd like to move into the idea of our production, of Pacific Opera's production, and the mechanics of putting that together. You are in the hall where it's being rehearsed. Some of you have actually been in rehearsals in this hall before, and some of you, at least one of you, is in Clemenza di Tito. And you'll notice that there's this multicolored tape on the floor. That represents the set. Now, I have never had an eye for those things, so even seeing the little design and photos don't really give us an idea, but they give you a little bit of one. So you can see what these lines represent if you want on the way out to have a peek at the set design and the costumes. And of course, it's being prepared musically. And so I would like to invite to join us up here our principal conductor of Pacific Opera, an associate conductor for the Victoria Symphony, and an all-round wonderful guy, Mr. Joey Pietraroia, Giuseppe Pietraroia. I have to point out that Maestro Joey's first assignment with Pacific Opera was to cover a week of rehearsals of A Masked Ball back in 1992. So we've known each other for a long time, as I'm fond of pointing out. Yeah, I've known Joey for more than half his life. It's great to have you on board. One thing I didn't realize until Friday, this is your first full Mozart opera.
This is my first full Mozart. I had the opportunity, it's funny, both of Mozart's last operas. I had the opportunity to conduct one performance of Magic Flute back in 2009, and now here, this is the first Mozart from beginning to end, so I'm really excited.
And how are the rehearsals going?
Very well. We're well into it. The orchestra starts on Tuesday, so we're almost at the end of our second week of staging, and we've pretty much blocked the whole opera now. Now it's just about reviewing, and today is a double chorus day. So we have the chorus in the afternoon and the evening, and so we could get all of those scenes put in, and then tomorrow we do a final run through in this space before we move to the theater. Wow.
Now this happens very quickly, and
probably just as quickly as it did at the premiere. However, we've had the music for a while.
Yes.
So you can imagine that if Mozart was writing it on his way to Prague, that he probably didn't have a lot of time to rehearse and put it on the stage. So that probably had something to do with the reception on the first. Maybe it wasn't completely. The singers weren't like. You get the music 2 weeks before. I mean. These singers have had the music for a while, but if you were rehearsing, putting it together, and having to learn new music, and having the orchestra learn new music within that space, that's something.
And it's like the famous story of the Don Giovanni overture. The orchestra sight read it at the premiere.
Yep.
So we're not having to do that.
No.
On the other hand, they didn't have stage directors for operas in the same sense that we do.
Right.
So you're working with a director, so the rehearsals involve aspects of musical preparation as well as staging.
Right. Yes, so we usually work through the music with the singers. We run it through with the piano. We figure out tempo and intention, and then the stage director will have their take on it. The singers come with their take on it. I have a take on it based on my take comes with thinking about the whole arc of the piece from beginning to end and how these scenes fit together and how the aria fits together. And then sometimes we have a discussion, and I might come here with an idea of a tempo or a phrasing based on what I think the character is what the character is thinking or what their mindset is, and then the director might have a different take on it, and the singer, and then I think, oh, okay, I see that, which might, it will then maybe alter my thought about tempo. Not drastically, but I'm saying maybe a little bit here, a little movement there, a little time here to get that shift. And so that's something that happens in this room right away, like right from the start. And then we adapt as we go, and we see what the staging requires as well. Sometimes a little bit of time to just breathe and go to the next phrase, or so there's a bit of give and take with that as well.
And in this particular work, when we do a Don Giovanni or a Figaro, usually at least some of the singers are familiar with the music because they will have been in other productions, but this isn't the case in this.
No, it's not the case. Everyone is making their role debut, so they're singing their roles for the first time, as well as me, so we're conducting this for the first time. And the other exciting thing is that all but two of the singers are making their company debuts. So it's very exciting to have that. But they're all so keen and so prepared, and that makes it so much easier too, because you start from a certain level. You don't have to, like I said at the premiere, like maybe learning notes. You're not actually learning notes. You come and then it goes from here to there.
And the singers who are not making their role debuts are Tracy Canton, who was Donna Elvira in our last production of Don Giovanni, and Stephen Hegedus, who's been in many of our productions. So he might be familiar to some of you from previous things. So Joey, would you explain to the audience what they can expect to hear when the recitativo secco is being performed? What is Kim actually responsible for doing?
So that is a good question, because as Robert said, the recitativos, it's believed that Mozart didn't have time, so he didn't write the recitativos. He would have given that, like we said, to his student Süssmayr. And all the singers say, you can almost feel like this is not Mozart, because some of the way the words are placed in a phrase, and some of the harmonies are a little odd sometimes, and it just doesn't. You think Mozart wouldn't have done that? Maybe, but they still work, but there's something about the recitativos that feel a little bit like maybe Mozart didn't have a complete hand in them.
Now we're talking about the secco recitatives.
The seccos, yes. He wrote all of the accompanied recitatives, the orchestral accompanied recitatives. But the other thing is that oftentimes the recitatives are long, and they're pages of recitative, and you don't want to sit there and just listen to recitative all night. So in order to keep the action moving and get to the actual arias and ensembles, the director makes decisions on those recitatives and says, well, this bit of information we don't really need, because that's going to be, they're going to explain that in the aria that's coming up, so we don't have to repeat that. So we make cuts in the dialogue that keeps the action moving forward. Now, when you would make a cut in a straight dialogue, you just go from this word to that word, or this sentence to that sentence, and it's easy, it's seamless. But when you have harmony underneath with someone playing piano, and you go from a C major, you end on a C major, and then you make a cut. Now there's a whole bunch of harmony that happened here, and now you're starting here, and you're in, I don't know, F sharp major or something, and then that doesn't coincide to the ear very well. Well, Kim then has to adapt and maybe play a few chords in between that gets us to that new harmony and makes it seamless. So that adds another little layer where we have to figure out harmonies. And so Kim, when we had all the cuts earlier in the summer, she went through and thought, okay, this doesn't work with this, so I'll have to do this, and then send that list to the singers so they know where the harmony is going to go. Then we come into rehearsal and we run through the recitatives, and Kim plays them through, and we do this and that. But then it keeps growing, and she keeps working through it, because then when the staging happens, she may adapt one of those punctuations to something very short, or something, maybe she'll break a chord and play an arpeggio really softly based on what the action is, or what the singer's intention is. And the singer might slow something down or might want to emphasize a certain word, and so Kim will then play a chord that's a little slower, or to emphasize. So it actually does help the singer, and sometimes the singer will lead the harpsichordist down a path of louder or softer, or sometimes the harpsichord will play the change so that we can see the change in the character's thought process, and the harpsichord then leads the singer towards another thought process. So it's very collaborative, and Kim will be in the pit, and the lid will not be on there, so that because that would be where it's set in the pit, so the sound would be pointing towards the stage and not into the audience. But we always mic the harpsichord or the forte piano because they're so soft that we do have to enhance the sound of it so that the singers can hear it as well. But by having the lid off, then she can also have a good eye contact with the stage. So she's always got an eye on the stage so that she can see where the singers are when they're about to do something that needs a certain chord or something. And so that's always back and forth. So she and that's completely free. Like, I don't conduct those. That's between Kim and the singers. We work things out, and I may make suggestions in rehearsal about try this here, or try this that, and she comes back. But it's a real process.
And something I should make clear is that all that's written in the Mozartian score is the bass notes.
Right.
So the player of 1791 would have just improvised the chords based on the implications of the bass notes. So the harpsichordist is basically improvising. In modern editions, they put chords, but nobody just plays the chords.
No, they always do little, yeah.
I have to relate this little anecdote. This is going back to, I think, 2011 when we did La Cenerentola. You were conducting
2010, yeah.
2010, and I was playing the harpsichord. And at one point, the two ugly stepsisters, who were actually two very beautiful women, were waiting for the prince, and I couldn't resist in a rehearsal. I played the opening melody from Someday My Prince Will Come. And so Tom Diamond said, oh, keep that in. So I did. That's the only mention I've ever received in Opera Canada, I think.
You won't hear little bits like that because this is, after all, is a serious opera. Yes,
exactly.
But in comic operas, oftentimes you will hear the harpsichordist do something fun because it's comic, and you can add those little flourishes in.
Yes. So you're beginning with the orchestra this week.
Yes.
Tuesday. Now, I would say that our friend Glynis Lation always says the thing about directing opera is that there's never enough time. You must feel the same about going into the orchestra rehearsal.
Yes, it always feels rushed. I think if you were in Europe and you had, well, maybe not nowadays, but where they have state subsidies and you have 9 orchestra rehearsals for a Mozart opera or something, you can get really into the nitty gritty. But the lucky thing here is that we have an orchestra that's been with Pacific Opera since the beginning, and they've really, the Victoria Symphony is really, the musicians have really learned about what it is to be an opera orchestra. Not every orchestra can be an opera orchestra. Certainly, you have to know that you are not basically on stage and you're not the showcase. You are there as a collaborator with the singers, and so they're there, they listen to the singers. They know where the singers are going, they can phrase with the singers, they breathe with the singers. They know how to turn a corner really quickly when they need to. So they've become a really, really top-notch opera orchestra, which really helps when we need to, get things going really quickly. Mm-hmm. And they play Mozart really well too, so they know the style. We have quite a few musicians in the orchestra who play very varied music, like from contemporary, new works to Baroque, and so we have people in the orchestra that understand the style. And so it makes it a lot easier. That
is good, because the other thing that not everybody remembers is that the singers are basically up there without a net, in the sense that the old-fashioned tradition of having a prompter, you can hear that in some of the live old historical recordings. You can hear somebody just speaking the beginning of the next line. Mm-hmm. And we don't use that, and I don't think many houses do anymore.
No, I think
so. And they're performing from memory, which is not the case. Mm-hmm. So they need that support and that attention. And so sometimes you'll see the conductor throwing cues to the singers. Can you talk about that process?
Sometimes there are complicated, intricate ensembles, and so the singer relies on the conductor to give him a cue. To say, this is, you come in here, yes. And they like that sort of stability. They sometimes it could be an important, it might be an entrance that's a little bit odd, where you would expect to come in here, but you're actually a bar later, and it's just one of those things. And oftentimes singers will say, I really need a cue there, can you make, and then I mark that in my score. I make sure that I'm always watching them to make sure that they have that particular cue. And sometimes in the complicated ensembles, you need to really make sure that the singer can come in, because we don't have a prompter. And a prompter would normally give a little cue and also whisper the word. That's why in French they're called a souffleur. They basically just blow or whisper the word to the singer just before they are about to sing. And so I find myself, yes, having to cue the singers when it's and musicians in the orchestra. If you have a trumpet player or a horn player who hasn't been playing for 20 bars or 50 bars, sometimes they like that you just at least give them a glance and say, "Yep, it's coming up. Here we go." After a while, they can relate to what's going on stage, and they know that their entrance is about to come up. But they like that support, and that's basically what you're there to do, is to give them that support.
And the other thing that not everyone might realize is that some professional will have reduced the orchestra part onto one piano state, one brace for piano, and that's what the rehearsal pianos will work from. But you were saying on Friday that you actually tend to rehearse from the full score right from the beginning and throughout the process.
Yeah, I like to use the full score throughout the process because first of all, visually, I get used to the page turns and the way it looks on a page. And as a conductor, after a while of rehearsing the orchestra and playing, you're not following every single bar. After a while, it's big blocks, and you can see the big blocks, and you know what's coming. And you turn a page, and okay. And sometimes, after doing it a few times, you can turn a couple of pages, or you can go for a while without even looking down at the score, and then turn a few pages, because you're so used to it, and you've been working on with the orchestra, and you get more comfortable with it. But in my early days, I'd use the piano score in staging rehearsals because it was easier to communicate with the pianist to say, we're on page 23 or whatever, we'd be on the same page. But then switching to the orchestra score, now everything is looks different than the piano score. So I tend to use the full score right from the beginning so that I can get that. And you also see what instrument is playing at what time, and it does affect the way you might think about the sound at that moment, or what kind of an attack. So if it's a string instrument, the string instrument will have a different attack than a brass instrument. It might be a little softer. You can get a certain type of sound, so it gets your ear used to what to expect in certain spots. And you can anticipate maybe this is going to be an area where we're going to have to be careful for balance-wise. Right?
So it is quite a process putting one of these things together. And you mentioned 2 rehearsals today. You generally have 2-3 hour rehearsals a day, don't you?
Yeah, up to 6 hours. Sometimes, and we did in the first week, we have a 3-session day, which takes us 9 hours.
9 hours.
3 session days.
Yeah, those are kind of exhausting for the
yeah.
conductor, and especially the rehearsal piano.
Yeah, it can get long. But this is such great music that I remember in our first week we had a 3-session day, and by the end of the day I was like, wow, that didn't feel like a whole day of rehearsing because it was so much fun and such great music.
That says a great deal about this piece to begin with. Mm-hmm. So opening night looms.
Opening night looms. It's a week Wednesday already.
So you're looking forward to it?
I am looking forward to it, yes.
Well,
now you wanted me to say what Empress
Yes,
Maria
yes,
Luisa
because
said. Now I think she was Italian, was she? Or
yes.
She had a baby, yeah. So I think the reason she may have said it, if she did say it at all, was that being Italian, she obviously had a penchant for more of the Neapolitan style opera seria, and this one was maybe not that. And she called it una porcheria tedesca. Doesn't that sound great? Una porcheria tedesca. Whether she said it or not, it's just a great phrase.
And with the syntax, it means a swinishness German.
Yes.
That's right. So, I think that history has certainly proven her incorrect. But as both of us have said, that's one of those rumors that we enjoy because it's funny, but we can't embrace.
Oh, something else. Can I just say something
yes,
else about Salieri? Because you mentioned, the relationship. What's interesting, and through that week because there was a week of festivities and things, and they even performed. I think there was even a free performance of Don Giovanni the night before Clemenza. So you can imagine there was stuff going on. But two of Mozart's masses, including some of his motets, were also played during the coronation. I think there was a separate coronation for the Empress, and one of Mozart's earlier masses, the coronation mass, it may have been titled Coronation Mass after this performance. But all those pieces were conducted by Salieri, because Salieri was the Kapellmeister, was the court composer and conductor, so it was his duty. So he actually conducted, other works of Mozart's during the coronation festivities. So there was collaboration there.
Yes, there was, and there was admiration. Yeah. Joey, thank you so much. You have 6 hours of rehearsal, and you took the time to come and address us, so we're very, very happy to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Always a treat. Now, I'm just going to conclude by talking a little bit about the post-premiere life of La Clemenza di Tito, and also what happened to it after Mozart's death. As we've already said, Mozart, first of all, if all the people who claim to have been present at Mozart's death in his room were actually there, he must have died in Madison Square Garden. There's no. He became sort of superstar as soon as he died. The idea that he died in obscurity can be debunked just by pointing out that the announcement of his death was in papers in Paris, in London, in Prague, in Berlin, almost immediately. So that doesn't happen if you're obscure. And the idea of the pauper's grave is simply because it was one of Emperor Joseph's reforms to try to, there wasn't enough real estate in Vienna to keep burying people with these big, vast mausoleums. So he wanted a bit more equality amongst the disposal of the dead. So they were just wrapped in a shroud and put in a common grave to accelerate the decomposition process. A really, really palatable topic of conversation, isn't it? And Constanza did not go to the graveside. She was advised against it because it was December. She had 2 young kids. And so she's gotten a bit of a bad rap, the widow Mozart. And of course, she had these 2 kids to support and some debts to pay off, so she needed to sell her husband's music, not all of which had been published. And so she's been perceived as a rather cold, mercenary kind of widow. And during Mozart's own life, people said, largely because I think of Leopold, Mozart's father, that she was a bit of an airhead and a flake. She liked to sing and read fugues, one of the most cerebral and challenging type of music making that there was, and she encouraged Mozart to study fugue. And that is part of the late Mozart idiom, a much more increased interest in that complicated type of counterpoint. Airheads don't read fugues. We can take that as axiomatic. But in terms of her selling her husband's works, of course she had to earn the money to support her family, but also what would have happened to them if she didn't sell them? They could easily have been burnt in a fire or misplaced. So we can thank her that we have the bulk of Mozart's output. Not every work, because he kept a catalog and there's references to some works that have not survived or have not been discovered yet. But she also mounted productions of La Clemenza di Tito. It had not been heard in Vienna, so she put one on in 1794. Her sister Aloysia, who had been Mozart's first love, performed in it. And in the intermission, at Constanza's request, one of Mozart's piano concertos was performed, and it was played. The soloist was an up-and-coming young Vienna-based composer of whom you may be familiar, Ludwig van Beethoven. So she knew a thing or two, and she kept producing Clemenza di Tito. She could easily have mounted the ever more popular Don Giovanni or Figaro, but she obviously believed in this work. And so she brought it to Dresden, to Leipzig, and then back again to Austria via Graz and back to Vienna, all the way into the late 1790s. And one of the historians I like to read about said, we can perhaps believe that Constanza did this because she believed in what the central subject matter is, which is the proper, compassionate, magnanimous, and benevolent behavior of a leader who has all the opportunities to be a tyrant but doesn't take them all. And so perhaps she knew something that posterity took a couple of hundred years to learn. So that is basically what opera seria will do. And when we look at some of Mozart's works, flute has the idea of redemption and forgiveness. it's at the center, it's at the core of Abduction from the Seraglio, which is the first opera Mozart brought to Vienna. And certainly what's seen in opera at all is more moving than the Countess's pardoning of the Count in Marriage of Figaro. So that's central, I think, to Mozart's own personal ideology. One other thing that I'll say about this work that I just found very interesting is that immediately after the overture, we go into recitativo. And that is also true of Idomeneo, the opera seria that Mozart wrote for Munich before he moved to Vienna, and even one that he wrote at 14, Mitradate Re di Ponto, and we don't get to hear that very often. Mozart wrote that for Milan, and like these other two, it opens with recitativo. None of the others, like none of the Singspiel or opera buffa do. So it's an interesting little thing to look forward to. So you get to hear the orchestra because you'll get there on time and listen to it, and then you get to get an idea what the plot's going to happen because you'll read the surtitles. And I know that you're going to have a wonderful time with La Clemenza di Tito. And again, thank you for coming to listen to us on this beautiful sunny day, and we'll see you at the Royal Theatre. Thank you again.